I want to thank the American people for the extraordinary honor of being elected your 47th president and your 45th president.
The future is gonna be amazing!
L'élection de Donald Trump marque un tournant pour la tech américaine. Gonflé du succès de son candidat favori, Elon Musk est en passe de devenir l'homme le plus influent de la nouvelle administration. Mais les autres patrons des GAFAM ne sont pas en reste et vont certainement bénéficier de l'accession de Trump au pouvoir. Marx, animateur du podcast technocritique Tech Won't Save Us et auteur de la newsletter Disconnect, livre pour Synth son analyse de la situation suite aux résultats du camp républicain.
Yeah, I obviously don't feel great. I think I'm still adjusting to what it is and trying to get my thoughts together. I would say obviously initial reaction, I obviously don't like seeing Donald Trump elected in the United States because I think it has a lot of negative repercussions for the US itself. Obviously throws a lot of, kind of more global things into potential disorder. What is it going to mean for Europe? What is it going to mean for Canada, where I'm from? But if we're thinking about the tech angle in particular, I think it's really notable that certainly in 2016, Trump had the support of Peter Thiel and some other, conservatives in Silicon Valley, but largely it seemed like a lot of, the tech industry and even some of even many of the CEOs and venture capitalists thought they would be better off with, say, a Democratic win and a Democrat coming to power. I think that has notably shifted, and we've seen that very clearly, where a lot of tech billionaires, a lot of the influential figures in the Valley, venture capitalist CEOs, have been putting money into the Trump campaign. In the past about 6 months have become increasingly vocal about their support, not just for Donald Trump, but increasingly extreme right-wing policies that they want to see implemented and that they think are in their best interests. So I would say that is where my biggest concern is now, seeing the linkages that have been formed between Donald Trump and between this radical powerful segment of billionaires in the tech industry, how they have been able to select essentially the vice presidential, or now the vice president-elect, J.D. Vance. He's someone who previously worked for Peter Thiel, was very much in that orbit. And obviously, we all know that Elon Musk was a very influential part of the Trump campaign, especially in the final month or 6 weeks or so. So we can see very clearly that the tech industry is going to have a lot of influence on what the Trump administration does, the policies it passes, the types of people it's going to put into key positions. And so that is where a lot of my concern is if we're thinking specifically about what it means for tech, because, say goodbye to antitrust action, competition reform, goodbye to enforcement from the Federal Trade Commission or the Securities and Exchange Commission. SpaceX and Amazon have been very aggressively trying to destroy the National Labor Relations Board and deem it unconstitutional. So that means labor rights would be thrown into jeopardy in the United States, and union rights in particular. And of course, Elon Musk, his companies, and a number of tech companies are under a lot of investigations from a lot of different parts of the American government, a lot of different regulators and things like that. And they've made it very clear that they want to, basically ensure that those regulators have no power to hold them to account. So there are a lot of ways that this is going to be very, very great for, the billionaires of Silicon Valley, but I think on the flip side, very bad for, a lot of the people who feel the consequences of what these tech companies do.
Do you think that cyber-libertarianism is going to frame the entire Trump presidency?
I don't think so, mainly because I think cyber-libertarianism describes a certain moment in Silicon Valley, but I feel like it is less descriptive of what is happening now, right? I feel like what we saw in the past in Silicon Valley, when we're thinking about the cyber-libertarian perspective, is certainly the tech industry always had a relationship to government. There were always subsidies going to Silicon Valley from the US federal government. The federal government was advocating for Silicon Valley companies on the international stage, hoping to see them grow and expand. But largely within Silicon Valley, they had those relationships, but they just wanted to ensure that the government wasn't kind of getting in the way of their businesses and their innovation and, the types of technologies that they wanted to roll out and things like that. I think that after the push toward antitrust, the push to further regulate the companies, the push to hold them accountable for the types of things that they have been doing for the past, number of years as their companies have gotten larger and larger, and thus, the public and regulators and the government have become more aware of the problems and the harms that come of the business models that they were engaged in. I think that we've seen over the past few years, and you could say earlier with some of the other people in Silicon Valley, but a shift, I would say, towards something more like, say, a cyber-authoritarianism, right? Where they seem much more interested now, not in telling the government to leave them alone, but in seizing the levers of government and ensuring that they work for their purposes. Because in the past, the government was very favorable to Silicon Valley, right? And they could have this more, this more hands-off approach where certainly they worked with the Obama administration, they worked with the Bush administration, and they got particular benefits out of that. But now it seems very clear that through the Biden administration and, earlier than that with what was happening in the European Union, as they were threatened with regulation, as they were threatened with antitrust, as they were, increasingly coming under scrutiny for the actions that they were taking, that they decided that it wasn't enough just to say, please leave us alone. Now they want to make sure that they have a lot of influence on what the government is doing very directly. And you see that in the way that they've got involved with the Trump campaign. But I would say you also increasingly see that with figures like Elon Musk, with how he is trying to, elevate right-wing, extreme right-wing movements in a lot of countries around the world that he sees as beneficial, not just to his personal political view, but also to his companies.
Yeah, and I was surprised because basically Elon Musk did try to influence largely the result of the election, but on the contrary, you had Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, who were even Peter Thiel, which was pretty surprising to me that they were actually very behind in the show, not trying not to actually make too much fuss about the situation and trying to be more respectful of the maybe next upcoming new president. What do you think about that way of why did they do that on your opinion?
Yeah, I think you can see two different approaches, right? Or maybe several different, maybe a range of approaches kind of on a scale. But you have the Elon Musk who was very explicit about the support, putting in over $100 million into these political action committees in the United States to ensure that, basically he would get the influence of Donald Trump, but also hopefully see him elected. I think that in Elon Musk coming out publicly for Trump, he also gave permission to a lot of powerful and influential figures, a lot of people who have hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars in wealth, to also come out in support of Trump, to also be giving money to the Trump campaign, names that wouldn't so much be household names, but are still influential within the bubble of the tech industry. But then you also had some of these other powerful CEOs, as you're saying, like Jeff Bezos, like Mark Zuckerberg, like maybe people at Google and Microsoft, not explicitly, coming out and putting their hands on the scale of the election, or saying that they were going to give money to a particular candidate or something. But I would say that, looking at different ones, some of them were involved in different ways, right? If you look at, say, the way that Facebook or Google with YouTube or Amazon with Twitch were treating their platforms, they were not, regulating false information spreading on their platforms in a way that they would in the past, or trying to suppress the people who were spreading that type of information. They were pretty clear that, people were open to do that, which was a real shift from what they were doing in the past. Of course, Jeff Bezos killed an endorsement at the Washington Post for Kamala Harris, because I think it's pretty clear that he saw that was going to be against his business interests at Amazon, at Blue Origin, the other things that he controls. Mark Zuckerberg, of course, in the past, he has given a lot of money to local election efforts. So to kind of bolster, just electoral workers and polling stations and things like that. This time he didn't do it because in the past the Republicans have said that he was trying to influence the election for Democrats by doing that. And he actually came out in an interview and said that I believe he called Trump a badass in particular. So, you know, it's not, they weren't like completely out there, but they were still doing things that one would not make the Republicans angry, but I think that in other ways you could perceive as being favorable to the Republicans or wanting to make sure that regardless of what happened, that they were going to be in a good position to, you know, benefit personally, but also have their companies benefit from whatever administration came next. And I would not be surprised if some of those people were much more open to a Trump presidency than they might have been in the past, both because of how their personal politics have shifted, but also because of how many of them have turned on the Democrats under Joe Biden in particular, because, you know, he's been trying to regulate the tech industry, and it seemed pretty clear that Kamala Harris would have done the same thing.
How do you foresee the future of the tech industry in that context? Because obviously there will be quite a lot of change. Do you think there will be... There was supposedly a privacy law on the way in the US. I suppose that's the kind of thing that will be probably abandoned along the way. So how do you see the development like in the next couple of years?
Yeah, I think the key thing is that you're not going to see a whole lot of development, in the sense that I think efforts at regulation will be put to the side largely. You know, for example, there will not be any kind of significant AI regulation, or if there is, it will be crafted by industry to be in favor of industry. You know, the crypto industry, cryptocurrencies, were also very influential in this election, spending over $100 million on various races around the country, not so much on the presidential level, but to try to ensure that often Republicans were elected instead of Democrats. Sometimes they backed a Democrat, but if they did, it was someone who was very clear that they were favorable to loose regulation on the crypto industry, right? And so I think you're likely to see that open up, and for more crypto trading to happen. What the broader impacts are going to be, it's hard to say. I think that you're going to see Lena Khan, who's the head of the Federal Trade Commission, lose her job. Also Gary Gensler, who is head of the Securities and Exchange Commission, because they are people who are directly in the sights of tech billionaires in the crypto industry in particular. And I would say if you see anything on the front of, say, tech regulation, it's probably going to be a continuation of this Republican scare campaign against the social media companies to say that they are biased in favor of liberals and against conservatives, even though that I would say is clearly not true. But the right wing in the United States knows that they can easily use those types of arguments to kind of scare social media companies and, you know, the executives at them to ensure that there's not effective regulation of what is happening on their platforms in terms of the spread of right-wing conspiracy theories or right-wing hate speech or things like that, right? To ensure that that kind of stuff can spread pretty easily and will not be moderated or the people who spread it suspended. And I think that we've already seen moves in that direction. And I would say that if the social media companies, you know, try to move forward with anything like that in the future, which to be honest, I don't see them doing, then you'll see the revival of those kind of narratives within Congress. But again, like I would say that is kind of the main thrust where we'll see tech regulation. I would say the main thing will be more subsidies for the tech industry, more deregulation for the tech industry, taking on the regulators that have been trying to rein the tech industry in because they are so close to the Trump administration.
And do you think they will be inclined to be more aggressive toward Europe to make them, you know, clinch on regulation, and toward China to actually make them also make some moves?
Yeah, I definitely think so. You know, we already saw that under the Biden administration where, you know, he was taking these measures to kind of restrict and keep down the Chinese tech industry to ensure that Silicon Valley and the US tech companies were protected, because, you know, the US tech companies were seeing their global market share that they have been able to carve out over the past couple of decades start to become threatened by the rise of Chinese tech companies, getting to a level where they could be competitive on software and increasingly on hardware as well. But what we have also seen, of course, and I would say the Biden administration wasn't as critical toward Europe as it was doing regulation, as it was doing, competition investigations and things like that. I do think that's going to change under a Trump administration because he is much more nationalist, which with the Make America Great Again kind of stuff, he is very connected with the tech billionaires of Silicon Valley. He doesn't see them, in the kind of confrontational way that Biden might have. But also, we have already seen examples of tech billionaires reaching out directly to Trump and telling him that they have problems with European regulations on the tech industry. Apple CEO Tim Cook, in particular, is reported to have had a call with Donald Trump where, he identified EU regulations as being a problem and EU investigations into Apple in particular. And we know that in the last Trump presidency, Tim Cook was able to get a major tax cut on Apple's, foreign earnings, so he could bring them back so the company could bring them back to the United States at a much lower tax rate. And so I think those are the types of things that the tech industry will be trying to work with the Trump administration on. And so what does that mean for global approaches to the tech industry? What does that mean for Western cooperation on tech industry? What does that mean for, the European narratives around wanting to build its own tech capacities, become a competitor with China and the United States, become this third pole? I think those are going to be really interesting discussions that we'll be seeing play out over the next 4 years, and that we'll be seeing escalating because it's going to be very clear. It already is quite clear that the United States wants to ensure its tech companies remain the dominant ones that we all depend on, whether we're in Europe or Canada or wherever else. But I also think that a lot more countries or regions, are getting kind of fed up with that, with that state of affairs. And under Trump, with the backing of the U.S. tech industry, he will be being much more explicit about the fact that, he wants us to be dependent on those things. And I'm not sure, European governments or the Canadian government or whoever else is going to be as open to that as they were in the past.
Another big loser is climate.
There are more than 8,000 data centers in the world. According to the International Energy Agency, data center energy consumption is expected to double in 2026 to what it was in 2022. Most of that electricity still comes from burning fossil fuels, which release the greenhouse gas emissions causing climate change.
What is at stake here, because there is quite a lot of numbers that saying there is the addition of a nuclear power plant to actually feed the AI and electricity. You have extraction coming from the mines to create CPUs and GPUs, obviously. What is at stake here?
Yeah, it's grim, right? When you're thinking about the climate, things were already looking bad under the Democrats. The U.S. is not meeting its emissions targets. Certainly, it's, with the Inflation Reduction Act, they were doing more to try to encourage more private investment in climate technologies, but they were not anywhere near doing what is needed to be done to actually bring down their emissions and actually try to promote, a shift toward greater sustainability and renewables and all that kind of stuff. And even under Kamala Harris, she was promoting fracking and, drilling for more oil and all these sorts of things. Donald Trump, of course, is also promoting that, but to an even greater degree. And he has already made it clear that he plans to repeal a lot of climate legislation that has been passed. The other piece of it, of course, as you're saying with the tech industry specifically, is that they are on a push right now because of the hype around generative AI and the boom in generative AI over the past 2 years to build a ton of massive data centers around the world that require a ton of energy, water, and other resources in order to power them. And in order to do that, they're looking at nuclear energy, but let's all be honest, nuclear energy, building a new nuclear facility doesn't happen overnight. It takes quite a while to do that. Personally, for me, I feel like a lot of their talk about nuclear energy is more marketing and PR rather than something that's going to happen in the short term, when we already have reports from the United States, from other parts of the world, that the reliance on fossil fuels, if not the investment in new fossil fuel projects, is actually increasing, in part because of the demand from data centers, right? So the companies talk about renewables, they talk about nuclear, and there are obviously debates on whether nuclear is even something that we should be looking at in the first place. But the reality is that they're requiring more fossil fuels in order to do this. And as we see in many parts of the world, when renewables are added to the grid, often those fossil fuels don't go offline because the existing fossil fuels, because the amount of energy that is needed is increasing so much, in large part because of these data centers, right? The tech companies have been quite clear that they don't mind this. Their emissions are going up significantly, and the CEOs of the companies have basically said that this is just what's happening because this is the new market that they're competing in. We know there was reporting in the Financial Times a couple months ago that Amazon and Meta in particular are trying to rewrite the rules around carbon accounting. So if they buy offsets and if they buy renewable certificates, they can claim that their emissions are much lower than they are. I think it's very obvious that the tech industry is going to be pushing harder on these things to make sure they're not held accountable, and will be doing what they need to do for PR reasons to say that their emissions are going down, when in reality that won't be the case, right? I think that the biggest opportunity here, if we're thinking about the tech industry, is for people like Bill Gates, who have been pushing this narrative and this idea for a number of years that we don't need to change the fundamentals of our society or anything like that to address the climate crisis. All we need is some new technologies, and basically swap out the energy systems that we use, and everything else can stay the same. We don't need to address, the vast inequities, all of the wealth and the emissions of billionaires and things like that. They can stay where they are. And all we need is for him personally to invest in particular climate companies that will solve the problem for us, right? And so I think as the US federal government pulls back even more from the meager efforts they were already taking on climate, I think you're very clearly going to see people like Bill Gates step into that void and say, we have the solution, which I would argue is not an actual solution because it relies on false tech solutions, geoengineering and things like that, which I think are going to drive us straight over the cliff, but allows them to make money in the short term.
Yeah. We were speaking about data centers, and you actually published 4 episodes on your podcast about the data vampires. Can you talk a little bit about that work? How have you been putting into that series? What's at stake, the major figure, just to get a sense of what's happening here?
Yeah, sure thing. A lot of it relates to what is happening with generative AI and this boom in the number of data centers that are being constructed, right? But it's not to say that it starts with generative AI. These major cloud companies, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google in particular, have been significantly increasing the number of data centers and the amount of money that they're putting into building data centers for the past number of years. And that has just escalated further with generative AI. These are infrastructures that require a vast amount of water, electricity, and computer components, which require a lot of mining, in order for them to operate, right? And I would say that there are several big problems here. One is the climate piece that we were discussing, where the emissions of these companies are significantly increasing because they're building these infrastructures. But I would say the other piece of it is the question of whether we actually need all of this computation in the first place. And that is what a lot of the series is directed toward. Because the companies claim that we need all of this computation, all of these data centers that they're building for generative AI and for other uses that they are putting out there. I would say that they haven't proven that generative AI has widespread, positive use cases as they are promoting. But I would also say that, a lot of this infrastructure, a lot of the storage and computation that they're building out is also necessary for a particular business model that they have created, where they need to collect vast amounts of data on all of us to feed their kind of ad targeting systems and things like that. And I would say that I think that the trade-off between the amount of resources that are going into these infrastructures and the benefits that we as a public are getting out of them has really gotten out of kilter. And that actually we could use a lot less computation to provide the public benefits of digital technology to the masses, to the public, without needing to make the sacrifices that these major tech companies want us to make so that we can continue to serve their business models, make them more profits, and basically create a future that they are much more interested in creating than I think the vast majority of the public is. And so that is kind of like the thrust of the series, what we're looking at with the series. And through the series, I talk to activists in a number of different parts of the world who are pushing back on data centers, but I also talk to some experts about the bigger picture here and the kind of future that these tech billionaires are trying to build, and just how divorced their view of the world is from regular people, and how little the average person kind of figures into how they see the world and our place in it.
I read recently that actually they were probably at some point they will give you the car just to collect the data, and
Right.
so that kind of trade-off where basically the good by itself doesn't mean anything in terms of money value, and that's just your personal data that is actually. But I mean, what is your view on an economy that is actually turning upside down in a way where basically you don't buy anything, but you are selling yourself in a way to actually acquire things?
Yeah, I don't love it, obviously, right? I'm certainly uncomfortable with it, right? And I think that the kind of generative AI moment and the push for AI right now has really put that into focus, right? Where we have kind of had this trade-off for a long time, where we get these products for free, the search engines, the social media, profiles and things like that, as long as we are willing to give over all of this data to these major companies. But I think what we are seeing is, there was a trade-off there that, yes, we would expect a certain level of service from using these companies, a certain level of benefit from it. And I think over the past couple of years, we have increasingly seen the benefits of those services erode, right? The quality of social media platforms, the quality of the Google search engine has been getting worse. Meanwhile, these companies have been pushing a lot of AI services that, on the one hand, I would say are not nearly as useful as they make them out to be. But on the other hand, there's this push to basically build AI and build digital interfaces into so much more of the society that we interact with, that we depend on. And that actually limits our ability to, get the kind of services that we expect, limits our choices in how we interact with the world, because all of a sudden, our choices are what has been coded into this system that we now have to interact with in order to receive anything that we depend on. And I think that we tend to understate the potential wider impacts of something like that, right? Because so many of us, can interact with these systems, and maybe we're like middle class or above, and it seems like, maybe they're collecting a bit of data on us, but this is working for me, right? But I think we can very clearly see there are many examples of how quickly that kind of potential benefit or that perceived benefit can very clearly turn into, a real drawback, right? And a potential harm if it even goes that far. So I'm not super comfortable with the degree to which we have allowed this to go, because a lot of it has been sold as convenience over everything else. I hope and I feel that things are starting to shift on that question. People are starting to ask more questions about what these companies have built out, but we'll have to see if that results in real changes. And I would say, looking at the Trump election, it's going to be much harder to get those potential changes to actually be realized. Maybe the states in the U.S. will help move us forward. Maybe Europe will kind of, tell the U.S. that it's not going to, appease the Trump administration and still keep doing what it wants. J.D. Vance right now is threatening that the United States will pull out of NATO if Europe tries to regulate Elon Musk's platform. So maybe they should, regulate Elon Musk's platforms and see what happens.
And probably the last question, some people are predicting that the AI bubble will burst at some point, very in the near future. Yeah. What do you think a burst like that could provoke on the tech industry, and more generally on the economy, the world economy? Because that's, the amount of investments are tremendous in that sector, and that could create something quite catastrophic in the end.
Yeah, I certainly think so. And I also think that AI is a bubble right now. I think that is pretty clear. And I think that there's even been a lot of like major banks and investment firms that have confirmed it at this point, right? So I don't think that is something that is really controversial to say. My immediate feeling is that the bubble will potentially last longer now that a Trump administration is in office, because you'll see the deregulation, but you've also seen just in the short amount of time since his election, a real boost in a lot of major tech stocks, which means that there will be more money to continue flowing into inflating the bubble, right, before it crashes. And that's not me making a prediction on when exactly it will go bust, because you never know what's going to happen next month, in 6 months, what have you, right? But I would say, I think the question around what happens when a bubble does burst is an important one, because the longer it lasts, the more it is inflated. When it crashes, the greater potential of a negative impact. Will it be something like the dot-com crash in the late 90s, early 2000s, which really wiped a lot of things out, or will it be much more isolated? I would say that I think that there is the potential for wider impacts with this one. I think if we look at, say, the crypto crash a few years ago, that was much more isolated to a smaller, part of the economy, right? It was a very isolated sector. It was not interacting with a lot of other businesses. I would say AI is not that, and it has spread out much wider. I would also say the bubble itself is bigger. But I would say the other piece of it as well, when we're thinking about AI, is that I don't know if you've noticed this in Europe, but there's been a lot of commentary I've noticed in Canada about how great the American economy is doing and how much ahead of Canada the United States is in GDP and stuff like that. And that's not to say that the United States economy isn't stronger generally, but I would say that part of the really good numbers that they have been able to show in the past couple of years is because of how inflated their stock market is, and the tech stocks in particular. And part of that is because of the AI bubble, and that never really factors into those kind of comparisons to other countries and regions. And so I think that we have kind of overstated the degree to which the American economy is doing well, because there is a bubble in its most valued sector and most valued stocks, right? So yeah, it's hard to say exactly what the fallout will be, but it seems inevitable that there will be a correction there. And I think that the potential downturn, the potential implications could be widespread. The only thing that might blunt that, of course, is that if interest rates come down enough, maybe that makes it easier to drive a new wave of investment as soon as the AI bubble crashes. But again, it's hard to know exactly what will play out here.